Welcome to the Media Storm studio. Our guest today is a journalist specialising in US foreign policy and civil liberties at Dropsite News, who has reported across many outlets, including The Intercept and Al Jazeera, and appeared on CNN, BBC, MSNBC, and more. Researching this topic, he has been one of the most consistent voices and reporters on the real-life impact of sanctions on ordinary civilians. Tuning in from New York, welcome Murtaza Hussain.
Thanks for having me.
Hi. Now, listeners, you'll also hear from voices from other countries affected by sanctions throughout this show who have spoken to Media Storm before. But yeah, researching this topic, Murtaza, something we found was that all roads lead to your reporting. You are one of the most dogged reporters and skeptical commentators on this topic of sanctions. Why are you so critical?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was growing up, one of the big issues in the news at the time, when I was very young, I would say, was the issue of sanctions on Iraq. Those sanctions destroyed Iraq. The healthcare system, the education system, the infrastructure collapsed, such that when the U.S. invaded 10, 12 years later, they found a deeply, deeply impoverished country which had been ruined by sanctions. And some estimates say hundreds of thousands of children were killed. And I recall reading this and being horrified at the time, even when I was quite young. It's basically a form of warfare. And it can be just as violent as any other form of warfare, even more so and more indiscriminate. But we tend to think of it as somehow softer. It really isn't. And the experience of Iraq has now been replicated in other countries as well, too. So I think that that's what originally piqued my interest in the subject and caused me to look into it further.
I think for me as well, I've been affected by hearing human stories from people who've been directly affected that I haven't read about growing up and reading about it in the media. For example, a person I know well, a Syrian, he is a refugee in the UK and once tried to send pretty much most of his savings to a cousin in need in Egypt. And because the transaction went through a currency exchange, it went through the US channels. This is pretty standard. And when it went through the US channels, it was seized for some loose connection they had decided to the big wide world of terrorist activities. The money is gone. He was given basically no information and no route to attempt to claim it back. And this made me really wonder about the power imbalance. I wonder if there's a case that it could even help countries like the US as they sort of have a gatekeeping role in financial transactions in the world stage. I just don't know if why we don't have more of a problem with the power imbalance of sanctions.
It's a fantastic point. I've had the same experience dealing with people in different parts of the world whose countries are sanctioned, and it makes life impossible. It makes life very, very difficult. That's actually was also a very radicalizing experience, just seeing the way the inequalities in access to basic financial mechanisms. So when you can't use your bank, you can't send a wire transfer. We take it for granted that we can do those things, but we can't. Your life can become impossible very quickly. You can lose a lot, and people do lose their money for this reason, not for any personal thing that they did, but because of these very arbitrary and opaque rules that cannot be challenged and that are put in place for different political reasons. I'll give you an example. I got really into Bitcoin some years ago, and not because of the financial speculation aspect, because specifically of what you're referring to, that I needed to pay people I know for work, colleagues and journalists in war zones of Syria, Afghanistan, things like that, to remunerate them for the work they did for us. But it was impossible to pay them. We couldn't pay them because there was no bank that would send to Afghanistan. No bank would send to Syria. And they were just ordinary people who were trying to earn an income. They were not doing anything nefarious. And they could not even understand the level of legal scrutiny that's taking place against them or every single person in the country, just by virtue of living there. To this very day, I have this problem. How do you pay people who are in sanctioned countries? Yeah, and the inequality is just very obvious in the situation.
Yeah, and while it's hurting civilians, there's also the question of how effective it is at actually hurting the people it's trying to hurt. You shared a report recently on X showing certain Iranian crude exports to China had remained stable despite US sanctions. And you wrote, due to overuse globally, the sanctions regime gets weaker every year. What did you mean by that?
The reason I said it's getting weaker is twofold. First of all, countries, there's so many sanctioned countries now that they have their own little world separately now. We sanction Russia and Iran and many, many other places. They start doing business with each other and they start building their own financial payment mechanisms by force, effectively. I think when they sanctioned Russia, that was a turning point, actually, because you're sanctioning a gigantic part of the global economy. Maybe at that point, you're going too far, because if the global economy that's sanctioned starts to look almost as big as the unsanctioned economy, then you've created just another parallel economy which could be self-subsisting on its own. Secondly, China is another world unto itself. Like, we had a long world where America was the only really big power that mattered. It kind of called the shots for many, many decades since the end of the Cold War. But now China is a huge market that can be self-subsisting in a way. So if you don't want to deal with American companies, that's okay. You may have like 12 different companies in China who can deal with you. So gradually, because of the fact that so many countries are sanctioned, so many major countries are sanctioned now at this point, and the fact that these alternatives are growing economically, we're seeing the gradual degradation of the power of sanctions, and even the power of the US dollar will decrease. International transactions are settled in US dollars. If you can use the renminbi, if you can use alternative currencies, if you can use gold, then people will do that, and they're starting to do that now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn now to the mainstream media and its continuous failures to humanize debates about sanctions. In 2022, Venezuelan journalist Ricardo Vaz published a scathing piece arguing that Western news outlets obscured the fatal impact of US sanctions in an act of calibrated honesty. He cited language still used across the mainstream, like saying Washington had sanctioned the government rather than sanctioned the people of Venezuela, despite them experiencing the largest economic depression in the history of the Western Hemisphere and one of the biggest ongoing exoduses.
So Vaz, he also lists articles that quote White House representatives saying things like, the unilateral lifting of sanctions on Venezuela is not going to improve the lives of Venezuelans, and then failing to ask a single Venezuelan what they think. Here is the closing statement in his article. He says, with their calibrated efforts to conceal the consequences of sanctions, Western journalists have in fact made thousands and thousands of Venezuelan victims invisible to the public. It is they who deserve to be sanctioned.
How would you categorize Western mainstream media coverage and debate around sanctions? Is it fair to say that civilian voices are sidelined in Western coverage of sanctions?
I'm not sure about the UK, but at least in the US, there's incuriosity and lack of awareness people have about this whole sanctions regime. It's a very elite-driven enterprise. There's just not a lot of coverage or interest in the incuriosity about the impact of US foreign policy abroad. With that said, when it does get reported sometimes, yeah, it's kind of reported as matter-of-factly. Well, several more entities in an X country were sanctioned, but there won't really be any analysis of what this means for people practically in that country. When you sanction the central bank of a country, what does that mean exactly? For the average person there, that could mean horrifying levels of inflation. Suddenly, the whole life savings could be wiped out in a night. The country may not be able to import medicine, food. It makes life very, very difficult and very, very painful for many people. But that angle is not very manifest. It's reported more coldly in a matter-of-fact way. And maybe if it was reported, people still wouldn't care. I don't know. But the thing is, it should be there for the record.
What is the impact of these voices of civilians being sidelined? How can we learn from the past if we don't listen to them?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like we're not learning from the past. We're kind of repeating the same errors before, and the errors people don't even know are errors. Something I've realized is something kind of chilling and daunting. But the Iraq sanctions, famously, Madeleine Albright was asked about the sanctions impact in an interview, former Secretary of State in the U.S., and she said, well, someone asked her, well, 500,000 Iraqi children have been killed by sanctions. What do you think about that? Is it worth it? And she said, something to the effect of, yes, it's worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And Is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
But I realize that for a lot of people and policymakers, the purpose actually is to hurt the population. They're doing this to hurt the population of these countries because, whether they say it or not, is that they want to cause so much harm to the population that they just snap and they overthrow the government or the civil war breaks out or something like that. They're not actually aimed at, affecting a change in policy. That's why I find them to be more indefensible in many ways. It's not a tactic in many cases. They're trying to just destroy these populations, literally using economic warfare. So it's a very sinister kind of system.
Let's now look at some of the current sanctions stories appearing in our headlines. Firstly, we'll take an example where civilians are calling on the international community to stop sanctioning their government, Syria. In December, Syrian revolutionaries toppled the country's dictator Bashar al-Assad, who had waged a bloody war against his people for over a decade. Indiscriminately bombing the oldest populated cities in the world, disappearing, torturing, and murdering Syrians at whim, using chemical weapons against them, and causing the world's biggest refugee crisis. His repression was the main stated cause for the majority of international sanctions against Syria, which targeted the military, tech, and financial sectors, as well as individual members of government. Firstly, did these sanctions help topple Assad, in your view, Murtaza?
So I wouldn't say the sanctions necessarily are what caused the government to collapse. I think they helped weaken the government such that the soldiers didn't want to fight. They hadn't been paid in a long time on the government side. That definitely had an impact, in my opinion. But I was there about a month and a half ago, and I've never seen in a very, very long time a country with that level of devastation economically. People don't have anything in Syria. They don't have enough food. They don't have electricity. They don't have basics of life. It was a middle class society economically prior to the war. People have less than nothing. It's like 0 out of 10. It's not all because of sanctions. It's also because of corruption and the impact of the war itself. But I think sanctions are a primary part of it, to be honest. Because I was also in Ukraine last year, and Ukraine's also devastated by a terrible war, and hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. But if you are not in the front lines, it almost seems normal and they're not sanctions, they're actually getting aid. They're getting aid and support. So, you can go have a normal evening in Kiev almost. It's kind of like something you can put your head down and almost forget about for a second, but you cannot have a normal evening in Syria. And even if it was aimed at the government, it did impact ordinary people as well too. The issue is now that the government has fallen, and the sanctions were in theory, because of the human rights abuses of the government. But now the government, which did those acts, is gone, and the people who are ostensibly were being protected by the sanctions, the Syrian people they're being sanctioned on behalf of, they're still sanctioned now, which doesn't make a lot of sense morally. I think ultimately now the sanctions are becoming a form of leverage, whereas, we sanctioned Assad, but we're going to keep them on until you give us X, Y, and Z, and then maybe we'll take them off. And, those sanctions are still impacting people. They're impacting the victims of Assad, even though they were, in theory, aimed at Assad himself. He's not even there anymore.
Thank you for explaining that. The next example we want to look at is an example of where civilians are calling for sanctions from the international community, but against a different government that is abusing them.
We spoke to a Ukrainian campaigner calling for wide-sweeping sanctions against Russian fossil fuels. She comes from a grassroots group called Razom We Stand, which argues that anything less than full sanctions amounts to helping fund Putin's war in Ukraine and funding a lot of money. Here's what Ilona Oleksium from Razom We Stand told us about why they are calling for even more sanctions against Russia.
Most of our team members are Ukrainian, including me, and we know the actual cost of the fossil fuel business. Everyone has lost something in this war. We have seen the pain and destruction, witnessed family being broken, and watched children dying. That's awful. Since the start of full-scale invasion, Russia earned over 800 billion euro from fossil fuel exports, money which continue finance like bombs, missiles, drones, which killing our people, our friends, our family. No, it's not okay. And despite of this, Western governments continue allow these billions to keep flowing into Russia war chest. That's why we are fighting against the fossil fuel evil, to ensure that no one else experiences same suffering and that our children are safe.
What do you think of existing Western sanctions against Russia? Do they go far enough?
The European Union, United Kingdom and US have taken steps to restrict Russian fossil fuel exports, but these measures are fragmented and inconsistent. For example, only 25 vessels from Russia's massive shadow fleet are sanctioned by all 4 major jurisdictions, leaving hundreds of ships free to move Putin's oil and gas around the world. If we are serious about stopping Putin, we need outright coordinated sanctions that leave no room for evasion.
What would you say to people who worry that sanctions are a form of collective punishment and ultimately harm civilians more than they harm malicious regimes?
This is false narrative that Putin and his allies love to promote. Sanctions are not collective punishment. They are a necessary tool to cut off the resources that fuel war and protect innocent lives. Also, fossil fuels not only finance wars, they also drive climate collapse. Our fight is not just for Ukraine, it's for a world where fossil fuel sanction accelerates the global shift to clean energy, which benefits all nations by reducing climate risk and securing energy independence.
Something she says, Murtaza, is that these sanctions wouldn't amount to collective punishment. I wonder if you would challenge that, and if so, how would you balance victims of war or aggression calling for us to stop funding aggressor governments with concerns about collective punishment, about punishing all Russians?
I would say that not all sanctions are inappropriate. Some of them actually can play a constructive role, particularly sanctions which are targeted at specific elites, which are involved in human rights abuses and so forth. I think that what sanctions, when they can become inappropriate, is when they are sort of, we can call sectoral sanctions. You're sanctioning an entire sector of a country's economy. That inevitably does collectively punish people. The situation in Ukraine is horrible, and it's devastating, and the Ukrainians have been victims of the situation, absolutely. And I don't blame them at all for wanting sanctions on their oppressor. But I think I find that in many, many cases, when you do these broad sanctions, it doesn't really have the impact that people are hoping for. What usually happens, as in almost every case, is that the sanctions come on. People, elites who have access to, resources and connections ordinary people don't, they continue operating as they were. They find a workaround, okay, oil sanction, we'll send oil in this other way. People get our money, maybe it'll be less money, but, we'll have enough for ourselves. It's the people who are below that, who don't really have any impact on the policy, or maybe not even agree with the policy, maybe against it. They don't really have any way of getting around it. So you often find perversely that the sanctions end up solidifying the hold on power of the very people you're trying to weaken. So in this case, if you're trying to weaken the Russian government, you may not succeed at that. You may succeed at hurting the Russian population while even increasing their control over them.
We had an example there of Ukrainians calling for sanctions on Russia, but we've also spoken to civilians from other countries who are calling for sanctions within their own country. In Georgia, protests have raged for over 100 days against the government under Tbilisi, whose Georgia Dream Party is blamed by people for democratic backsliding and cuddling up to Moscow.
Now, at the time that the protests first broke out, Media Storm covered them as protesters were being beaten, detained, tortured.
We are on the verge of dictatorship from authoritarianism. It is the gang against the people. It is the men in the police uniforms against the youth of Georgia. It is the oligarch with his ruling party who captured the Republic of Georgia.
Back then, we spoke to Georgian journalist Tata Chikveladze, who reiterated to us this week why she and other citizens believe sanctioning wealthy political elites would help their cause.
Wealthy elite sanctioning would definitely help
the entire country if they would sanction the oligarch Ivanishvili. That would definitely help. Like if endless protest of 117 days doesn't help the government and oligarch Ivanishvili himself to change his mind about selecting new elections, maybe that will be a little bit of a threat for him.
Another example, albeit on a smaller scale, is Israel, where a small but significant minority is calling for international sanctions against specific leaders they see as damaging democracy and driving human rights atrocities. Some 200 Israelis living in the UK have urged the UK government to sanction Israel's Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. So again, very targeted sanctions. We spoke to Danielle Bett, a Scottish-Israeli woman representing Yashad, a UK-based organisation calling for political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
There is a huge difference between collective sanctions on the state or the people of Israel and targeted sanctions against extremists and individuals. For example, sanctions that are targeting violent settlers or extremist ministers. They make a distinction between Israel proper and the average Israeli and between people who are exacerbating the conflict and the problems. And I think it makes it clear to Israelis that they aren't being punished for their identity or even for their opinions, but those who are being sanctioned are specific people who are causing harm. Another thing that we've seen is that when sanctions are announced abroad against extremist settlers, for example, it often brings about a really constructive debate within Israeli society on an issue which is unfortunately often not very widely reported on, such as settler violence, such as the occupation. And I think that's been really helpful as well. On the other hand, when it comes to collective blanket sanctions against Israel, they can cause harm. It's true that it's a legitimate form of non-violent action, but that doesn't necessarily make it helpful or effective. Collective punishment against Israel isn't constructive, in my opinion. It also is often harmful to the institutions and the people working to fight for peace, justice, and equality on this land. So I think it's really important to make a distinction between sanctioning harmful people and bodies and sanctioning Israel as a collective.
Mataza, what do you think? Is there a way to protect civilians while using sanctions smartly?
I think so. I think those measures that you refer to, they're a more appropriate means of using sanctions in a targeted way, a focused way to impact specifically elite decision makers, who are the people who really matter when it comes to foreign policy and call the shots in these countries. Those people are not saying sanction every single thing that goes into Georgia or everything that goes to Israel, because they know it's going to impact innocent people if it does that. So it's very rare to see people calling for these broad full country sanctions on their own country. Targeting specific corrupt officials or officials involved in human rights abuses, I think that's a good way of splitting the difference and actually getting the better utility of sanctions. I'll give you an example. In Pakistan, covered a lot in the last couple of years. There's a military dictatorship at the moment. People are calling for the head generals to be sanctioned, so forth, because a lot of them have the wealth in London and New York and places like this. That would be devastating for them. It's not impacting the country. It's impacting them on a very personal level. And they may have to change their own approach and their policies just so they can maintain their own well-being on a personal level. So I think that's good. I think that's, not morally objectionable in any way. And the only thing I object to is the wholesale sanctioning of civilians, because first, I think it's immoral, but also I think it's ineffective in achieving these goals.
And that is, just to be clear for listeners, that is something that is still very, very common. It's what we're seeing in Venezuela. It's what we're seeing in Iran. We're seeing it to an extent in Yemen, already some of the poorest countries in the world. Thank you for specifying, I suppose, which sanctions we should be problematizing more. To close, I wonder if there are solutions that you might advocate besides sanctions. When we see a foreign government commit atrocities against its people or breach peace terms and activists want to mobilize their governments to care and do something, what should we be calling for if it's not at least wholesale sanctions against that country?
Yeah, you could sanction the trade of certain items which are relevant to the situation, like arms trade, for instance, sanctioning certain companies which are involved. You could call for sanctioning the whole country. You just said people, when they do that, they should understand the moral implications and also the full. I don't think people understand necessarily all the time, and maybe if they did, they wouldn't ask for that or they ask for something else. Because first of all, the sanctions is definitely going to impact a lot of innocent people. It's something which is kind of called for, I could say, casually at times. So it's a very serious and grave thing. Do a little more research on what you're trying to accomplish and focus on the industries or on the companies or on the entities or on the individuals who are most responsible and target your activism around that. So that'll accomplish two things. First of all, you'll minimize the collateral damage. Secondly, you're more likely to get support from people inside the country. I think they're focusing a little bit more, doing a little more granular look at what you're trying to accomplish and targeting them in a very measured way is both more moral and also more effective in achieving certain policy outcomes.
I'd maybe just add to that as well, like listen to what civilians in those countries are saying, listen to what protesters in those countries are saying, because they will probably have thought about what solutions from the international community would help them most, right?
Yeah. But Murtaza Hussain, thank you so much for joining us on Media Storm. Tell us, where can listeners follow you, and do you have anything you would like to plug?
Yeah, just please follow our work on dropsitenews.com. And, you can see myself and Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm and many of former colleagues of The Intercept continuing our work there. We're able to do it in this new format. Please do subscribe and then please to check us out and do a podcast. And I'm the host up there as well, too. So, yeah, please check out Dropsite News and looking forward to seeing you all over there.